Australia, one of the most developed countries in the world and ranks among the best the OECD has to offer, has an education problem, and no one wants to talk about it. When delving into the Australian education landscape, we begin to see that SDG 8.6 and 4.2 become compromised, and the shining states of Sydney and Melbourne leave at the wayside, states in genuine need of assistance and change. I'm talking about the necessary policy shifts that will save the children of the Northern Territory. Welcome, Minister of Education, Head Minister of the Department of Education, and Minister of the Northern Territory. Today, I'll be talking about schooling retention in the Northern Territory. Schooling retention is 20 percentage points below the rest of the states, and that isn't even talking about the Aboriginal share. So, why is this happening? Well, we have the greatest proportion of Aboriginal Indigenous Australians, as well as the greatest proportion of people whose language is one other than English. We can also see that Northern Territory stands alone in its remoteness classification and has the highest proportion of remote schools in the country. These factors make it very difficult to learn without the specialized programs that are necessary for the unique demographics that we see. Programs were introduced, but they were either defunded or cancelled. This led to program fatigue, where many Indigenous Australians felt alienated and confused by the rigid teaching programs in place. Corrective courses of actions could include creating bilingual teaching programs and a return to EALD teams managing EALD resources, of which is currently not the case. When delving deeper, we can see that the unemployment and participation rates of the Aboriginal populations are severely neglected. Well, what does this have to do with schooling retention? Well, it's actually a large indicator into why the Northern Territory is the lowest in terms of per-student contributions by parents across all states, whilst having the highest amount of government recurrent funding per student. But this amount of recurrent funding isn't even being spent on making buildings or generating resources, with reparations on future and capital projects sitting at 0.09 million, which is by far the lowest amongst all Australian states. This is even compared to Tasmania, which is second from the bottom and is still 21 times greater. This links into the main issue, which is the erosion of funding for remote schools in the Northern Territory, where funding is based on attendance from the previous year, so pretty disadvantaging schools with low and unstable attendance. Ultimately, this causes a vicious downward spiral where if student counts increase from years A to B, there is not enough resources to adequately cater for them. Very remote schools have lost up to 50% of their funding and large chunks of their teaching staff as an outcome of this model. Gunther's 2019 analysis of the Northern Territory My Schools data highlighted that schools with higher funding per student and lower staff to student ratios exhibited higher attendance levels. Compounded by the pressures of school funding, there have been losses in a lot of the permanent positions for Indigenous teachers as well as assistant teachers, and this, according to Gunther, has the greatest effect on attendance levels. This is reflected in the data. While the average teaching numbers have more than doubled since 2006, the student to teacher ratio has remained stagnant, changing just 0.2 percentage points over the last 15 years. Attendance funding? Therefore, shifting the funding model back from attendance to enrollment may seek to remediate these retention issues and bring education back to the kids of the Northern Territory, reducing the impact early school leavers have on lifetime costs for both government and taxpayers, which are currently sitting at 18.8 billion and have social costs eclipsing 50 billion. Ultimately, this aims to lift the Northern Territory up with the rest of Australia, because everyone deserves an education, and we can provide the resources to facilitate that.